How can a person's entire reality become so distorted that they believe the calculated violence that they enact is not only justified, but a matter of self-defense against a vast invisible conspiracy? I'm going to dissect the chilling documented paranoia and profound behavioral clues that reveal a mind spiraling toward this devastating act of mass violence aboard a commuter train in New York. Welcome. I'm a licensed professional counselor, and this is my mental health analysis of the Colin Ferguson case. I will be focusing on the main mental health and psychological indicators while providing the backstory. I don't just talk about the crimes, I talk about the psychology behind the crimes and the mysteries that captivate us. I look beyond the facts of the case to understand the why of the crime. My analysis is based on my speculations. It's not a diagnosis of anyone involved in this case. The most compelling mental health red flag in Colin Ferguson's background is the long-standing, unwavering presence of persecutory delusions. What is the psychology behind a person who moves through the world feeling constantly targeted, convinced that everyone, from his college professors to his employers, is plotting against him? Ferguson was born in Kingston, Jamaica in 1958 into a middle-class family. His life was disrupted early by the death of his father in a car accident, followed by his mother's death a few years later. He moved to the United States in 1982. While this early loss and disruption is significant, the most glaring psychological indicator that developed over time was his growing and all-consuming belief in a wide-ranging conspiracy. By the early 1990s, this wasn't just a general dissatisfaction. It was a deeply ingrained system of thought that blamed all his setbacks on others. He accused officials at a university and a community college of conspiring to deprive him of an education. He lodged complaints that were investigated and found to be baseless, yet to him, the lack of evidence only proved how powerful and comprehensive the conspiracy against him truly was. He saw racism and injustice everywhere, real or imagined, and cataloged these slights into a definitive list of enemies. The psychological impact of this delusion is that it completely shifts responsibility. When a person believes they are a victim of a great secret plot, their actions, even violent ones, can be rationalized as a necessary preemptive strike or self-defense. It's a way for the ego to remain intact by reframing personal failures as an external attack. The second major red flag is the chilling transformation of these inner delusions into a physical, outward-facing motive for mass violence, an indicator of a break from reality. How does a man's feeling of being wronged, his detailed list of grievances, transition from a private delusion to a public execution of his own perverse sense of justice? The date was December 7, 1993. Ferguson boarded the eastbound Long Island Railroad, the LIRR train from Penn Station, a crowded evening commuter train. He carried a Ruger P89 9mm semi-automatic pistol and a canvas bag containing 160 rounds of ammunition. This was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was a carefully planned psychological performance. As the train approached the Merlin Avenue station in Garden City Park, New York, Ferguson stood up and opened fire. He walked down the aisle systematically shooting passengers. When police apprehended him, they found handwritten notes in his pocket. This document was a meticulously compiled list of his targets, not specific people, but groups. It included the Caucasians and Uncle Tom Negroes he believed were part of the plot, the New York State Workers' Compensation Board, the university, and other entities he felt had wronged him. The fact that he spared New York City, stating in his note that he respected then Mayor David Dinkins, only to choose Nassau County for the violence, speaks to a deeply organized yet fundamentally psychotic motive. The geographical shift was calculated. This was a critical psychological clue. The violence was not random to him. It was a rational conclusion drawn from his internal premise, an attempt to punish the physical locations and symbolic groups he had decided were behind the conspiracy. He killed 6 people and wounded 19 others before he was heroically tackled and disarmed by passengers. The victims were simply surrogates for the entities he felt were persecuting him. The most profound psychological red flag observed after the crime and throughout the subsequent legal process was an almost total emotional flatness and a complete lack of remorse. What is happening inside a man that has committed such a horrific, devastating act, yet shows no evidence of guilt, sadness, or even moral reckoning? In the immediate aftermath, Ferguson was described as calm and passive when he was handcuffed, but the psychological indicator became even clearer during the trial. His actions did not align with a person in a dissociative state or a moment of temporary insanity driven by a sudden rage. They reflected a profound emotional disconnect from the reality of his actions. His victims were not viewed as human beings whose lives he had ended, but an abstract enemies in his personal war. This lack of remorse is a common, though not definitive, indicator of severe personality disorders or profound psychosis, where the ability to empathize or feel guilt is compromised by the belief system. When a person's reality is so distorted that they believe their actions are just, the psychological space for regret disappears entirely. The fourth key psychological indicator, and one that turned the trial into a legal spectacle, was Ferguson's insistence on self-representation. What does it reveal about a defendant's psychological state when they fire highly experienced defense attorneys and take the reins of their own defense, not to plead insanity, but to deny the undeniable? Legal experts argue that Ferguson's highly plausible not guilty by reason of insanity defense, which his attorneys wanted to pursue, was his only chance. However, Ferguson completely rejected the notion of mental illness. He believed the defense of black rage being prepared by his lawyers would make him look weak and validate the conspiracy against him. He was found competent to stand trial, which is a legal, not a psychological standard. The consequence of representing himself was that it allowed his delusional system to move from the private sphere of his mind directly into the public sphere of the courtroom. He used the trial not to prove his innocence, but to air his grievances and prove the existence of the conspiracy. During cross-examination, he questioned the very people he had shot, demanding they confirm details that would support his bizarre claim that he was framed and that a white man was the actual killer. He presented a list of 93 potential witnesses, many of whom were unconnected celebrities or public figures, a number which he claimed corresponded to the year of the crime, 1993, an example of the complex numerical and symbolic reasoning often woven into a psychotic individual's delusion. This was not a legal strategy. It was a psychological compulsion to control the narrative and validate his warped reality in the most public way possible. A strong psychological angle to the why is the development of a system-beleaguered victim identity, where a person aggregates years of perceived institutional and personal flights into a single explosive justification. How does a series of perceived injustices in a person's life, work disputes, academic issues, and personal failures all blend together to form a coherent, fixed identity as a target of the world's malice? Before the shooting, Ferguson had a history of conflicts in every environment he entered. For his aggressive and uncooperative behavior, his belief was not that he had behavioral issues, but that he was consistently a victim of racial bias and a system designed to fail him. In one highly scrutinized incident at a university, he accused a woman of shouting racial slurs at him in the library. When the university investigated and found no evidence, the key psychological pattern here is projection. Rather than internally process his difficulties with authority, rules, or interpersonal interaction, he projected his frustrations outward, attributing his problems to external malicious forces. This victim identity became the psychological fuel for his actions on the train. He wasn't merely reacting to a current event. He was settling a psychological score that had been building for years, a desperate attempt to regain control and status by striking back at the system he felt had crushed him. The sixth psychological red flag is the remarkable, unshakable nature of his false narrative, a sign of the fixed absolute conviction common in delusional disorders. What is the internal psychological mechanism that prevents new, overwhelming evidence, dozens of eyewitnesses, the recovered weapon, and his own notes from correcting a false belief? Throughout the trial, despite overwhelming evidence, Ferguson consistently maintained he was innocent. His defense rested on the claim that a mysterious white man was the real killer and that this man had taken his gun, committed the shooting, and somehow framed him. The psychological significance of this is that it demonstrates a classic characteristic of a delusional disorder persecutory type, a diagnosis that was put forth by the defense psychiatrist. In this condition, the person's thinking is generally intact, but their beliefs about being persecuted are firm, fixed, and highly resistant to challenge. Ferguson's arguments in court, while completely untrue, were presented with a logical consistency that made them all more unnerving. The logic operates within the delusion. If the world is conspiring against you, then the police reports and eyewitness testimony are merely evidence of how deep the conspiracy goes. The mind creates a fortress around the central delusion, where every piece of counter-evidence is ingeniously reinterpreted as proof of the plot. The final and most tragic psychological indicator is the way the crime was an ultimate, desperate act of self-vindication for a person who felt powerless and unheard. When a person feels constantly marginalized, dismissed, or unseen, how does that deep-seated feeling of worthlessness drive the ultimate need for a public, violent declaration of their internal pain? Colin Ferguson's manifesto and his statements in court were not just lists of enemies. They were a cry for recognition. His actions, while horrific, were his final attempt to assert reality over the reality of the world around him. He chose a public place, a commuter train full of people returning to the relative affluence of Long Island, a setting that symbolized the mainstream success and normalcy he felt was denied to him. His violence was a desperate and fatal attempt to force the world to take his grievances seriously, to finally make them see the conspiracy he had been cataloging for years. In his mind, he was finally a central figure, a protagonist fighting for his own justice. This need for recognition and self-vindication, warped through the lens of profound paranoia, explains the intensity and calculated nature of the violence. It was a final destructive attempt to correct a lifetime of perceived slights and failures, a catastrophic consequence of profound untreated mental health issues. The trial ultimately convicted Ferguson on February 17, 1995, of 6 counts of murder and 19 counts of attempted murder, resulting in 6 consecutive life sentences. The case remains an example of the tension between legal competency and psychological reality. The law found him competent to represent himself, a decision that led to one of the most bizarre and disturbing courtroom spectacles in modern history. The psychological cost of his actions, however, was borne by the victims who survived and the families of those who perished that evening simply by making their way home. The psychological footprint of the shooting reveals a crucial intersection, the terrifying potential when a system of profound persecutory delusion goes unchecked, culminating in an act of targeted yet indiscriminate violence. This case is such a tragic case. I say this in a lot of my videos because they are. Ferguson was a man who suffered with profound mental illness. His paranoia got the best of him. He was managed to hold it off for a number of years, but at one point he just had enough. He wanted to make it stage, he make it scene. He wanted the world to notice him in the most tragic way. Unfortunately, for the victims and their families, for those who were wounded, everybody involved in this case, Even though it happened a long time ago, I'm sure they are still suffering the psychological consequence of this. So, what did you think about this case? Were there any elements that stood out to you? If you want more mental health analysis of true crime stories like this one, be sure to subscribe for more. And if you found this case compelling, be sure to watch this next story. It will make you more aware of your surroundings. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe.